Good morning, Discovery class. Really good to have you back. I want to talk today about a scripture verse that's puzzled me all my life. It's a statement made by one of Jesus' disciples. We don't know what his name was. We'll call him the nameless one. He posed to Jesus, and here's what he said. It's found in Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Jesus, teach us to pray. Now, we know that Jesus taught them the Lord's Prayer. It's found in only two of the Gospels. It's found in Matthew and it's found in Luke. And we all know what that prayer says. Our Father who art in heaven, give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses. But this statement in Luke chapter 11, verse 1, is more than that. He's saying, Lord, teach us to pray. Have you ever asked the Lord that? Have you ever asked him to teach you to pray? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today in our class. But I'm going to make it personal. I'm going to make it, Lord, teach me to pray. I want to learn to pray. So could you help me? Do you know where I learned to pray? Watching others. That's what the disciples did. They watched Jesus pray over a span of 3 years. When did he pray? How did he pray? Did it make any difference when he prayed? Do you ever watch others pray? Did your dad or your mom pray? Did they pray at the table? Did they thank the Lord for the food? What about your Sunday school teacher? Do you remember when your teacher prayed? Do you know when I went to the one-room schoolhouse way back then, do you know that our teacher, and I don't know if she was a Christian or not, she began our school day by praying. And then we'd go in and sing the national anthem. Well, today's lesson, I'm going to take you on a watch. I'm calling it a watch because our lesson, I'm going to call it a prayer watch. When I say watch, I mean more than that. I don't just see a person pray with his voice. I'm also going to study his actions. What's his character like? In other words, how does he live? How does he behave? What do others think of his behavior? Behind his back, what do they say about him? What makes him tick? In other words, who is he? This is Labor Day weekend, and we're coming to the close of summer, and it's almost over. The virus is not over yet, and I'm in our classroom, and there's nobody here but me. And the doors of the church are locked, and there's nobody in the church. All the hallways are empty, bathrooms are empty, sanctuary's empty, the gym is empty. And you know, when I sit in the class, I can see all of you. Behind me is the piano that Frida plays, but we can't hear her playing, and we can't hear us singing. And I want to wish you all a happy birthday. I want to wish you a happy anniversary. Many of you have had that great event since we've met together, like back in March. Can't do that anymore. But we're going to pretend, aren't we? So as I end, coming up to Labor Day weekend, I'm going to take this lesson that I'm going to show you about the watch, and I'm going to divide it, I think, into two parts. In recent months, Brentview Church has lost 3 giants. One was a charter member. The other 2, well, they'd been here forever. All 3 taught me to pray. I watched their behavior. I watched their character. I saw them come to church with their family. I saw them go home. I saw the jobs that they did inside our church here at Brentview. And I was so amazed. And as I watched them, they taught me how to pray because I wanted to be just like them. They each brought beautiful gifts to the table. And as they brought them to the table, they became teaching tools for me. And I found that was very infectious. Now, we're living right now in an infection called the coronavirus. That's not a good infection, and we don't want to copy that. But I do want to copy their infection, because what they did and gave me, I would like to emulate. These three giants taught me to pray. Their names were Melba, their names were Bob, and their name was Eric. Each had a wonderful character trait. Melba's was service. If she wasn't pouring coffee, she was filling a communion cup. Service. Bob, he had a radiant smile, and I would call him the Lord's Alka-Seltzer in the Brentview cup. Every time I saw that man, I had to smile. Eric, he was a builder. I got on-the-job training every time I followed that man. He was an architect, and he did some amazing things around this church, including designing it. Well, next week I'm going to talk about those three. But I'm going to give you some other examples of people in my life, one that I lived with, and others that I read, that taught me how to pray. I had a fellow student at seminary whose name was Gerald. Gerald and I were roommates. He was in the bedroom right beside mine. And I used to spend a lot of time visiting him in his room because I helped him do some of his reading. And the reason was, Gerald was blind, and his reading was done on Braille. And he took notes on Braille paper. Have you ever seen it? It's a very thick paper, and he has a little gadget that's almost like a steel toothpick. And he would punch into that paper his notes in Braille, so that at the end of the day, when he came home from class, he could take his fingers and run it along, and he knew exactly what the professor was saying. Well, Gerald had a wonderful prayer life. At the end of the day, he'd call me in, okay, Ron, it's time for pray. So we'd go in, and I would listen to that man pray. And I was absolutely dumbfounded, because when he would pray, you would think the presence of God was right in the room. Well, Gerald came from Nova Scotia. He came from the backwater of a little town. He went to Acadia before he got that's where he got his undergrad, and then he came to seminary, where we graduated. And he had a twin brother. Strange that his twin brother was normal with his eyesight, normal with his mind, normal with his life. He wasn't a Christian, but Gerald was born blind. Very strange. Now, when Gerald graduated, he left our seminary there in Toronto, and he went back to Nova Scotia. And when he went back to Nova Scotia, he took two little parishes. They were fishing villages right on the seashore in southern Nova Scotia. And these two villages had a twin church. The parish in the one was part of the association of the parish in the other. Gerald had, beside the one parish, a parsonage, and there he lived. Now, he traveled from that parish to the other parish in an amazing piece of transportation. Now, remember, he's blind. He can't drive. But he had a horse, and the horse's name was Molly. And Molly would take him after the service on Sunday at this church and ride him over to the other church where he'd fulfill his duties there as pastor. Now, on this church, the service was at 9:30. At that church, it was at 11:30. He had an hour, pretty well, to get between the churches. But he had disciples in both churches that led the service. And they were wonderful. And Gerald, when he would get there, his role was twofold. One, he told a story to children. He'd bring all the children up, and they'd sit around him at the front, and he would tell them a story. And the children loved him because they kept staring at him, knowing that this man is blind. He can't see me. And as they watched this blind man tell the story, they were almost transfixed because they saw this. My goodness, what's he doing? This man is telling me a story and he can't see me. But I love his words and I love his story. After he had had the children there, and then they'd sing a song or two, then he preached. And he would preach from Braille. And you know, the word got around that he became the blind prophet in the 2 little fishing villages. People came to see him. He was a bit of an oddity because they said, well, how could he be who he is and do what he's doing and do it as well as he's doing it? And then they used to look inside themselves and they would say, well, what's my problem? They used to come almost out of curiosity. But when they came, they noticed something else was coming because they almost felt the presence of God in that little parish church when Gerald came in and he preached. They used to tease him. They said, now, Gerald, I'll bet you your horse Molly has the best theology of any horse in Nova Scotia. Do you know what came out of those little parish churches? Missionaries, young seminary students. What he taught inside that classroom was absolutely amazing. Because he said, I think, Lord, teach me to pray. And his life became a prayer to all these people inside the church because they just watched the man behave. Well, that's really what prayer is. It's our behavior, isn't it? How do they see me? And how does the world see me? And do I make any difference? Is there a change? From these parishes, Gerald watched the Spirit of God in a movement that changed those little fishing villages. Now, here's another story. I told you we're going to watch a personality and see if we can learn from a personality. Billy Graham, he tells the story of Frank. Frank was a chief financial officer in a large corporation. He was the controller. He had a big staff. Frank was the spinal cord of the company's money. His department took up the whole floor of the company office. And Frank looked out his window at this big sprawling company that spread out before him. He had a personal secretary just outside his door. One day, the CEO of the company came unannounced and he wanted to have a visit with Frank. And the secretary said to him, "Sir, he has an appointment. He will be finished shortly, and then you can go in." "Haven't got time." He barged past the secretary, and he went in the door, and the secretary listened. And there was no noise. And she listened, and there was still no noise. And she continued to listen, and there was not a voice. And then she thought, what's that man doing in there? And the reason she knew is because Frank, every day before he would start his job, he spent a half an hour in the corner in front of a little chair on his knees praying. And he was a Christian. And he asked God to help him that day with all the decisions that had to be made in that huge corporation. And Lord, can I make them with you in mind so that when they're done, you will be pleased with what I do? It wasn't long before the CEO came out of the room and said to the secretary, "Frank, does he do that often?" The secretary said, "Yes." "Well, how often does he do it?" She said, "Every morning, sir." "Well, how long does he do it?" "I don't know. Probably 20 minutes, a half an hour." "Well, when he comes out, I want you to tell him two things. One, now I know why I hired him. Two, I want you to tell him that's why our company is doing so well. He's our success story. And then out he went. Lord, teach us to pray. See, that man, by his example, spread his influence not only to his secretary, but now it went all the way to the top, to the CEO. Lord, teach us to pray. Here's another story. Have you ever heard of Frank Charles Laubach? Well, he was born September the 2nd, 1884. He died June the 11th, 1970. He was 86 years of age when he died. He was born in Benton, Pennsylvania. He was educated at Union Theological Seminary in Columbia University. He was a shy man. He wanted to be a preacher, but people scared him. Large audiences scared him. So when he graduated from both those schools, he said, Lord, what do you want me to do? I'm available. What can I do for you? I'm no good in the pulpit. Don't put me in front of people because I'm scared to death. Now, Laubach was an Anglican. And he went to the Anglican Synod and he said, do you think I could go overseas as a missionary? What would you like to do? He said, I want to deal with poverty and illiteracy. Poverty and illiteracy. Yes, he said, I want to deal with the poor. And I also want to deal with people that can't read or write. That's what you'd like to do? Yes, I would. Well, where would you like to go? He said, I don't know. Where could you send me? Do you know where they sent him? He went to the Philippines. And he went to the backwater of that country. And Philippines has a large population. And they have many, many different religious faiths, from Christian to Muslim. Well, they placed him away over there where there's a Muslim group, away off in no man's land. And there he settled in. But you know, Frank Laubach, he did something very amazing. He came up with a literacy program. Here's what he did. He would take a young illiterate and one-on-one, he would teach him to read. And then he would take that student who he had taught and he said, I want you now to become a teacher to someone else. Do you get it? He taught an illiterate. That illiterate, after he got them, he would teach someone else. And he called it, each one, teach one. That became his mantra. Each one, teach one. That new teacher would bring his new student to Laubach, and Laubach would polish him up, and he'd go out and find another illiterate, and they'd start all over again. It's estimated that over his time in the country of the Philippines, he taught people to read and write to the tune of almost 2 million. Isn't that amazing? Each one, teach one. Now move the clock ahead to the year 2002. He came back to the United States, and the United States, through his denomination, the Anglican Church, they followed his success story. And they formed the Literary Volunteers of America. It's a volunteer organization, and it was worldwide for pro-literacy. In other words, people to learn to read. And from any language, in any country. Do you know that Laubach is the only American missionary to be honored on a United States postal stamp? It appeared in the 30-cent stamp back in the year 1984. The only missionary in history that ever had his mug on a stamp. What was Laubach's secret? Learning to read. Each one, teach one. Do you know when the Lord had that message, Lord, teach me to pray? That's what I want to do. I'm doing this with you. I want you to do this with someone else. Each one, teach one. I think that's a great method Isn't that a good watch to learn how to pray? Well, I got one more for you before I let you go. Let me tell you the story of Brother Lawrence. That wasn't his name. He was born in the year 1614. He was born in France. His parents were peasants, very poor. His name was Nicholas Herman. He had limited education. He grew up during the calamitous 30 Years' War, which devastated Europe between 1618 and 1648. And because of his parents' poverty, Nicholas was forced to join the army because there was a stipend that he got by being a soldier. He'd send that home to his mom and dad. He was wounded in that war, and he was left permanently lame. He became impoverished, almost a hermit. He decided, after 50 years of wandering and futility, that maybe they would take him into a monastery. So he went and knocked on the door of the monastery and he said, "My name is Nicholas Herman. I wonder if I could come and join your group. I have nothing to offer. I'm poor. I can't read, but I'll give you whatever I can. Would you let me in?" Well, they welcomed him in. Do you know what he did? He scrubbed pots and pans down in the kitchen. Now, when I say scrubbing pots and pans 400 years ago, do you know what these pans were? They're not Teflon. They're made out of cast iron. Many of them were pewter. And some of the pots were this big around. They were like pig troughs. And you know that these big skillets, they're in front of the fire never went out, nor did what was in the pot ever go out. They would start a bowl of soup back in January, and that soup would be still on in June. And they just kept adding to it. Well, when those pots had to get cleaned, that became Nicholas's job. And he scrubbed those pots, and that was his job. And he did this for 15 years. However, there's a beautiful sidelight to that story, because in the 15 years of washing the grease and those frying pans, he did it joyfully. And it says he did it faithfully, every day. Doing his dishes and doing the pots and pans, it gave him a profound sense of peace. So much so that the monks in that monastery decided to change his name. They weren't going to call him Nicholas. They said, "From now on, your name is going to be Lawrence. We're going to call you Brother Lawrence. So in the midst of all these monks and all of this, you're going to be Brother Lawrence." Visitors used to pop into his kitchen and just look at him and just to talk. He expressed rather unusual wisdom. Guests would sit for hours just to listen to his unusual insights. He was unpolished, and he had a wonderful sense of humor. And he gave a satisfaction to his visitors in such a way that they came back to see him again and again and again. He never complained. When his legs became so ulcerated and sore after 15 years of laboring in the pots and pans, he became a repairer of sandals so that he could sit down. What was Brother Lawrence's gift? What's he going to be remembered for, do you think? Well, despite his lowly position in the monastery as a dishwasher and a pot scrubber, he had a reputation for experiencing the profound presence of his God. And you know that the bishops in his area used to come and sit down and say, "Tell me, Brother Lawrence, could I talk to you?" "Oh, yes, by all means." They would sit for hours and just listen to this man talk. And all he did was teach them, "Lord, teach me to pray." When they saw his personality, they saw something in themselves that they didn't have. And this humble man, crippled from the war, from peasantry, he became almost the presence of Christ, right in the center of the seminary, right in the presence of the monastery. When he died in February 12, 1691, some of those tiny expressions that were said in that scrubbing of the pots and pans were placed in a tiny booklet called Practicing the Presence of God. You can get it today at the bookstore. They're conversations that he had that were recorded with other monks. And the key to his writing was this: he forgot himself and was willing to lose himself in God. In other words, he governed himself by love without interest. And the book is made up of those tiny little short stories. Lord, teach me to pray. As an aside, if any of you ever want to go to Italy, can I give you a secret? Mary and I went to Italy a few years back, and we stayed in monasteries. We were there for a whole month. We got an Italian rail pass. That's how we traveled. And we stayed in about 8 different cities in 8 different monasteries. These monasteries are half price to a hotel or a B&B. And they're wonderful. And the reason they are such, the Catholic Church now is finding it difficult to come up with nuns and monks to fill up those monasteries. So if there's some extra rooms, they're lending them out to guests like you and me. They all have an ensuite. They're quite sparse and Spartan, but they're very clean and they're very comfortable. And to me, when you turn the lights off, what's one bedroom over another? They're all the same, aren't they, when you fall asleep? And they have a lovely free breakfast. It all comes together. And at night, when you come back, you might want to sit in on one of their Vesper services. You can just sit in and hear them pray and sing. Beautiful little choirs. But there is a downside. Some of you in my class that are swingers and partygoers, you must remember this. At 10 o'clock at night, they have a curfew. And when they lock the gate and they lock the big door at the front, if you're late, you're sleeping with the pigs and the roosters out in the barn. Let me close with this. One of the great hymns that Frida has played for us and we've sung is one of my favorites. Remember what I've been saying. We learn to pray by watching others. And by watching others, we're really hearing us saying to ourselves, Lord, teach me to pray. I want to be like them. Here's the hymn. May the mind of Christ my Savior live in me from day to day, by his love and power controlling all I do and say. May the love of Jesus fill me as the water fills the sea. Him exalting, self-abasing. This is victory. Lord, teach me to pray. Next week, we're going to go and do the second side of this, but I'm going to bring you up to date. And I'm going to tell you what I learned from some of those giants that we've just put to rest here in our church. Before I go, I told you I'm going to tell you a story from the sunny side of the street. I told this to Mary, and she didn't like it. She said, if you tell that story, you're going to have craft dinner for 2 nights. Well, here goes my craft dinner. There was a seminary student who graduated after 4 years of study. And during the time he was doing his study, he courted 2 different ladies at the same time. One was as cute as a button, very pretty. And the other, a bit frumpy, but she had a beautiful singing voice. Just as he was approaching graduation, he thought, well, if I'm going to go and take a church, I should have a wife. So he had to make a choice. Am I going to choose button or am I going to choose frumpy? Well, he made his decision. Who do you think he chose? He chose frumpy. He got married. The day after his wedding, he woke up and he took a look at her. Sing! Sing! If you want to come and share a craft dinner, I'll see you at my place. That's enough for today. Will I see you next week? I'll look for you.